Hello, BookTube. I'm starting a new reading project today, or rather, coming back to a reading project that I had once started and then abandoned. I'll explain that later. But this is The Complete Stories of Oz by L. Frank Baum, published by Wordsworth Editions, which is, as the title indicates, the complete stories of Oz written by Frank L. Baum. Only it's not really the complete stories of Oz. I'll get into that maybe in just a moment, but let's back way up and start from the beginning. Sorry, this is what I do on these started videos. They tend to be self-indulgent. I talk about my history with a book, or in this case, with a franchise. So, like most people, my first exposure to The Wizard of Oz was the movie, and my I saw it on TV one afternoon um, when I was young. My parents didn't let us watch a lot of TV when we were young, and our viewing was quite restricted. But my mother was a big fan of The Wizard of Oz, and she was telling us, "You're going to love it," and she was telling us about the story. And the story sounded pretty exciting when my mother was explaining it. Something about a witch and an evil army of winged monkeys with wings that they have to fight. And it sounded like it was like a really action-packed story. And I was really excited to see it. And then I found myself quite bored by the movie. Now, I don't think I have rewatched the movie since I was a little kid, so I am way overdue for a rewatch. But it did not grab me the way it interested my mother. I once read an article on the internet with when those Star Wars movies, the new Star Wars movies, were coming out, The Force Awakens. And it was somebody who was of my mother's generation, a baby boomer, talking about how Star Wars was so popular with people of my generation, the Gen X or Gen Y crowd. And he was saying that he could not understand the appeal of Star Wars when it first came out. He said he was like a 20-something grad student studying film, and just looked down his nose at Star Wars and thought, oh, it's just a bunch of cheesy kid stuff, and had no idea how popular it would go on to become with the next generation. Anyways, he was saying in his article that what really made an impression on him was The Wizard of Oz, which made me wonder. This isn't a large data pool to draw from, but it makes me wonder if the Wizard of Oz movie what really did make an impact on that baby boomer generation, or the generation slightly before it as well. Because when did that come out? It was I think it even predates the baby boomers, but it would still have been around when the baby boomers were growing up. And then that, as stuff ages and has less of an impact, perhaps that's what happened, so that when we got around to my generation, it just didn't have the same impact it did with them. Um, he was talking about in the article how the Wicked Witch of the West used to give him shivers down his back as a kid, and the winged monkeys used to terrify him. And by the time I got around to seeing the Wizard of Oz, even though I had a relatively sheltered childhood in terms of media exposure, it was media for a previous generation. The pacing and everything was just moving way too slow. The thrills weren't what I expected. So, anyways, the movie didn't grab me, and I didn't subsequently have much interest in the story until I noticed sometime in elementary school that there were several different Oz books in the library. Or, in other words, I became aware at some point that Oz was a series of books. And at that point, it began to intrigue me, because I've always been a fantasy geek, and I've always been intrigued by long series that continue a single story. I do have to admit that looking back on my reading track record, I'm more intrigued by the general concept than I than I am. Sorry, let me start again. The general concept intrigues me. I do not have a good track record of actually sticking with a long series from beginning to end. I tend to lose interest after a few books or something like that. But I'm fascinated in the abstract by long series that are continuing stories following certain characters or fantasy. And this appeared to be what the Oz series was. Um, I didn't read any of the books as a kid. My youngest sister got into them when she was young, and I bought her some of the books for like birthday presents or stuff like that. I was kind of looking over her shoulder a little bit as she was getting into them, but I was never intrigued enough to actually read the series, and I got the impression that they were marketed more towards younger girls rather than teenage boys. So I was interested in the idea of a huge ongoing fantasy series in the abstract, but didn't particularly feel the need to read the actual books. Then, uh, in around 2006 or so, and the years following directly afterwards, some of you may be old enough to remember. Uh, sorry. Let me back up. I did actually read one of the books. It was the Marvelous Land of Oz, which had been one of my aunt's old books and was left in my aunt's bedroom. And when I was a kid, we used to do sleepovers at my grandmother's house. And after my aunt went to college, we would stay in her bedroom and read all her books and stuff like that. And I think she had The Marvelous Land of Oz in her bedroom, and I did read that book. I think that's the second book in the series, although I don't think I knew the order at the time. What's the chronology of this? Yeah, that was the second book of the series. Also, by the time I read The Marvelous Land of Oz, a lot of the characters who show up in it, Jack Pumpkinhead or the Gump or some of these other characters, I knew who they were because of the Disney movie Return to Oz, which is it's a Disney movie. I don't think it got released under the Disney name, but it was under the Disney umbrella corporation. Was briefly in theaters, but then got rerun on the Disney Channel during the 1980s, which is where I saw it. It's a much darker movie in tone than the original Wizard of Oz. And the Disney movie was based on The Marvelous Land of Oz and I think Ozma of Oz together. So I read The Marvelous Land of Oz and enjoyed seeing these characters that I had seen from the Return to Oz movie pop up in there, but never went further than that. Right. So once Wikipedia came into its own around 2006 and the years after that, some of you who are old enough to remember the years before Wikipedia and the years after Wikipedia might be able to identify with this. It was just catnip to nerds. Because I had grown up as a nerd, and I was fascinated by all these nerdy stuff. Like Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, Dick Tracy, Zorro, Tarzan. All this pulp fiction type stuff. But it was very hard to get information about it in the 80s. You would see an article in the newspaper occasionally or something like that, but there was no archive of information about nerd culture prior to the modern internet and prior to Wikipedia. And then after Wikipedia, all this stuff was at your fingertips. I learned so much about comic book history from Wikipedia. It's stuff, because I only vaguely understood the history of a lot of these comic book characters because, how would you? Okay, anyways, that's a digression. But one of the things, I used to spend hours online looking up stuff on Wikipedia. I still do to a certain extent, although I'm not as bad as I was back then. Because, like, back then I had so many nerdy questions so much stuff to figure out. Now I've kind of answered most of the questions I have, but one of the things I looked up actually is, how many books are there in the Oz series, and what's the chronology of them? Because I was still vaguely interested in this. And then from Wikipedia, I learned that there were 40 canonical Oz stories. So that includes the 14 Oz stories that were written by L. Frank Baum. But then after he died, the publishers wanted to keep publishing this, so they paid other people to continue writing the stories. And I think there were like 3 other authors or 3 other sets of writers who were hired by the publishers to continue writing. And that went on until like sometime in the 60s, I think, when for whatever reason the publishers ended the series. So there's 40 canonical Oz stories, including 14 by the original author and then others by other authors. And it ended in the 1960s. Now, fans kept wanting more stories. So there are non-canonical stories that were written by like the fan clubs of Oz or something like that. And this is all on Wikipedia. But for a long time, there were no new canonical stories until I think just relatively recently, in the 2005 or something, that the publishers started publishing more canonical stories. So I think we're up to like 43 canonical stories now, or something like that, or maybe the publishers accepted as canonical stories that were published. Or maybe it's not the publishers, maybe it's the estate of L. Frank Baum. Anyways, up until relatively recent times, the number was frozen as 40. New stories have since been added. So I spent some time on Wikipedia reading about the Wizard of Oz books, or the Oz books, but never actually reading the actual books themselves, never really feeling much of a need to track them down, until I saw this in the bookstores here in Saigon. It's by Wordsworth Classics, which publishes a lot of the classic books in Vietnam. I'm like a lot of Wordsworth editions, this has absolutely no introduction, no explanation or anything like that. It's just boom, here are the stories. But it's a long one. It's 86 pages. And included in here are the 14 books that L. Frank Baum published during his life, and then one extra book, Little Wizard Stories of Oz, which is a mini book that he published, according to Wikipedia, to drum up more interest in the Oz story before he was relaunching it, which they've also included in here. Now, they call this the Complete Stories of Oz, but actually, if you go to Wikipedia or if you start digging around, it becomes very evident that even if you limit yourself to the original author, L. Frank Baum, this is not the this is not the complete stories. There was a comic strip that was apparently written by L. Frank Baum about some of the characters from the Land of Oz that was in the papers for several weeks during one summer. And then there was also a subsequent book based on that comic strip called The Adventures of Wogglebug or something like that. I forget the name, but like Wogglebug was one of the characters who was in he was in the Oz stories, and then he got spun out. He became more popular in the comic strip, and then he got his own book eventually. According to Wikipedia, he was like a bit of a national craze at one point, or a national icon. It's just one of those interesting little semi-forgotten bits of pop culture history. But anyways, none of that is in here. Not the comic strip, not the other book that Wogglebug got spun out into. In addition, if you go through and if you read these stories, you discover that there are crossover stories with some of L. Frank Baum's other series, because it turns out he did other series. So characters from the other series will cross over. So there's a whole universe of L. Frank Baum stories, which is much bigger than this book. But this book is big enough, huh? It may not be complete, but it's the 14 stories, 14 books that he wrote plus one extra. So I actually bought this years ago, like back in 2015, I think, or 2016. And my intention at the time, even though I knew there was 14 books plus one extra within these bindings, my intention at the time was to just read the whole thing and then just review it as a single volume. That's what I had generally been doing at that point with books that books like this, where there are more than one compilation volume type books. It was actually before I started up this YouTube channel, when I was only reviewing books on my blog. And writing out those written reviews takes me a lot of time. I've wasted way too much of my life writing long book reviews. So I didn't want to write down 15 different reviews. I thought I'll just read the whole thing and then review it all as one. And I started reading it, and I started uncovering all sorts of little interesting things. Some of the things I've just been talking about, the Wogglebug and the comic strip and that kind of stuff. Now that's not all from this book. In fact, again, there's no. The publishers don't have any extra information in here, but that's information I acquired while reading this book and also checking Wikipedia at the same time. And also Tor Books on their website. They hired one of their reviewers, or she volunteered for it, or whatever, to go through and review all the books in the Oz series. And she has very insightful reviews in which she goes through and talks about things. Because there are a lot of interesting changes as you go through this with how L. Frank Baum was evolving his story. For example, if the first story everybody knows because of the movie, right? You find the Wizard of Oz at the end, and it turns out he's just a charlatan who's gotten over his head, the man behind the curtain. But then you get to the second book, and it turns out all of a sudden the Wizard of Oz is like this evil type character. And that was apparently because there was a play, long before there was the movie, there was a play that was very popular in 1900 or whatever, in which they changed the story for the play to make the Wizard of Oz turn out as a bad guy. So then, to keep this book series more in line with this popular play, they also changed things. And apparently the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodsman in the play were portrayed by very popular actors who were very good comedians. And so they were given expanded roles in the sequels. And then as this play, I guess, dipped in popularity, then that aspect of it gets dialed back. Those kind of things are all very interesting. However, I eventually lost interest in this book. How many did I read? I read like the first, I think I read up to the Emerald City of Oz, which is book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I read up to the 6th book, and I got into the 6th book. And then I started to lose interest because the problem with sticking with a series for too long is it does get to be a little bit samey. Well, kind of. There was some really inventive stuff in here, where you got the impression, especially in the first 2 or 3 books, that L. Frank Baum was trying really hard not to repeat himself. So they were going out into a whole bunch of different lands. I think in the first book, Oz Oz is like this really mysterious land. But and then the subsequent books, Oz becomes like the home base. Oz is like the familiar territory where all your friends are. And then it's all the lands outside of Oz that you have to explore, and that's where all the nasty creatures are in the sequels. Um, and yeah, there was like you get the sense that he's almost running out of ideas, but kind of in a really interesting way. Like they go to this land of vegetable type people, and yeah, a whole bunch of really trippy ideas. Um, you get the sense that these books must have been quite popular with like hippies who might have done LSD while they were reading it or something like that. But of course, L. Frank Baum was writing way before the hippie era, but just kind of that kind of like far out type stuff. So there was a lot of interesting stuff in here, but I did actually lose interest. And I didn't intentionally shelve the book. I just got distracted by other things, and then it was longer and longer that this book sat on my shelf when I wasn't reading it. And then eventually it got to the point where I was like, geez, I barely even remember the early stories now. And so then I decided that I'm not going to try and treat this as one single volume. I'm going to go back and treat this as 15 separate books. One of those being a mini book, but 15 separate books. And just go back to the beginning, read the book, review the book, go on to the next one, rather than try and keep everything in my head for one monster review. And that's I think when I decided my new policy was going to be, if I came across a volume that was several smaller books in one, I'd review each book separately. Which is why, when I got my hands on this book, The Chronicles of Amber, by Fantasy Masterworks, I reviewed each book in here separately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and go back to the beginning, reread those first 6 books. The Marvelous Land of Oz, this will be the 3rd time through now, because that was the one I had read as a child. And then, reread the first 5 books. I think the 6th book I started but didn't finish, but whatever. And then continue to move on through the rest of the series, and then try and knock out all 15 books. I think the way I'm going to manage it is I'm not going to make a started video for each new book in this volume. Started videos are what I do, what I'm doing right now, what I'm filming right now. When I make a video explaining why I'm starting to read this book and what my expectations are. I did that when I was doing the Chronicles of Amber, and I've decided that there's really not much point in doing that when you're just working through several books in the same volume. Because then every time you make a started video, you're like, well, the reason I'm reading this book is because I just finished book 2, and this is book 3 in the same volume, so I'm just going to continue on. By the way, apologies to everyone who had to watch those started videos back when I was working my way through this series. I think with multiple books in one volume, or perhaps with box sets, if I get my hands on box sets in the future, I'm just going to make a started video for the whole set, and then make review videos as I go along, but not make more started videos. Although I will make started posts on my blog, but not the videos. What else do I want to say? When I was reading this book, trying to read this book 5 or 6 years ago, it was interesting actually. When I had this book, during a break at work, I would take this book out or something, and a lot of people actually were surprised that there was a whole series of Oz books. I thought this was one of those. It surprised me at one point in elementary school, but I had then assumed that this was one of those cultural things that everyone picks up eventually. But yeah, a lot of my coworkers were surprised. They were like, wait, there's a whole series of Oz books? I mean, I know about the movie. I know there was that famous book. I didn't know there was a whole series. I thought this was something everybody knew by now. But yeah, I mean, just goes to show. Of course, you watching this video here are probably a part of BookTube. So that's a whole... You probably know that there's a whole series of Oz books. But your friends and coworkers may not. Non-bookish people apparently don't know there's a whole series. Yeah, what else do I want to say about this series? I do want to finish off this whole series, even though I petered out on my first attempt to get through this. But I think it will be kind of fun to have another go at it and get through the whole series. Steve Donahue, a big booktuber I follow. Actually, he's not that big, but big in some circles. The most well-read man on BookTube was asked about this series on one of his Q&A videos. Somebody asked him, the Wizard of Oz books any good? And he said, no, they're absolutely terrible. And that got me thinking. He may actually have a point. They are children's books. They are pretty elementary. I don't know if this is maybe the best use of time at my age, but I've got the book. I've already made a start of it once. I don't want to leave off incomplete, and it wasn't terrible. There were a lot of interesting ideas in these books. There were also a lot of flaws, and I'll try and talk more about that as I get through these books. Yeah, maybe I'll just finish this video off here. Yeah, I'll just finish this video off here. So, again, what I'll try and be doing is, as I work my way through the 15 books in this volume, posting reviews as I go along. And then I think what I'm going to do is the same thing I did with the Chronicles of Amber, is then maybe just do a final wrap-up video when I finish off the whole volume. Yeah, hopefully this volume will stay in one piece until then. It's already falling apart a little bit. Maybe I'll just tape that back up. Yeah, no pictures in this volume, by the way, which is maybe another unfortunate thing about getting it all in one volume. I think, if you were to buy these separately, they'd probably be lovingly illustrated. But the Wordsworth editions are always the real cheap ones. Yeah, actually, the more I think about it, maybe the loss of pictures is a serious defect, because I think when these were originally published, the pictures were a big part of the reading experience. But be that as it may, I'm going to go through without any pictures and just read the books, and then come back and talk about them on the weekly reading vlogs and review them when I finish them. The individual stories, I think, are relatively short. Like the first, of course, these are big pages with no pictures and stuff like that, and small margins. But the first book in the series is like only 96 pages. So, okay. So that's that.